There's a website called Outside Online that deals with outdoors like backpacking and hiking and walking and so on. There was a curious article in October of 2016 featuring a man by the name of Kyle Bodel. Now, what's interesting is Kyle was a middle-aged man at that time, and he did have some health problems. I don't know if you know this, for a man, a healthy body fat is between 10 and 20%. I know, we got to work on that, right? He was at 15, which is right in the middle, so he was fine as far as that was concerned. But his blood panel showed that he was one step before being pre-diabetic, and he had some health issues. And what he decided he was going to do was test what would happen to his body if he went on a long backpacking trip. So he had a blood test right before the trip, and then he went on a 29-day backpacking trip over 486 miles. So this was a long trip. Now, one other thing that he did, and if you're a backpacker, you know this, a lot of the standard backpacking food is very salty, and you really don't want to eat that every day. So he did the best that he could to bring natural, kind of high-quality foods with him. And so he went on this trip, 460 miles, and 29 days later, he got back home, and then he took another blood test, and what he found is probably what you can guess, is that there were improvements. But he was surprised at how many improvements. His cortisol levels had dropped. His pre-diabetic numbers were basically obliterated. He had gone from 15% body fat to about 6 or 7 without even trying. But for a dude, most importantly, he found that his testosterone numbers had doubled. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, don't get too excited, guys, because everyone will look at you and be like, what, are your numbers low or something? You know, you just have to act like, yeah, some people have that issue, you know. But here was a guy that took this blood test, and he found out that walking for all of these miles radically changed his physiology. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because in the same way, when we walk with the Lord, what we will find is that in the same way, he will radically transform us. In the same way that when we walk physically, our blood panel changes and we grow and we are strengthened and we are transformed. When we spend our lives walking with God, what we find is the same thing, that there is a spiritual transformation. Now, I want to just throw this right up at the beginning and say this, that if you are not walking with God right now, that you are missing out on the abundant life. And I don't mean a sort of health and wealth life where God is your genie and he's going to give you everything you want. What I mean is that there is a richness in walking with your Creator, because he walks with you, he guides you, and he grows you, and he changes you, and he transforms you. And it's all possible because of the death on the cross. And when we place our faith in him and when we walk with him, then we become new creatures. So, if you have your Bibles, stay with me in Genesis 33, and we're going to be talking about walking in maturity. Because what the physical walking does for the body, the spiritual walking does for the soul. Now remember, as we read the narratives of all Bible characters, the characters are not static. Paul was not the same as he was in early Acts, as he was in 2 Corinthians. Bible characters they're not static, they change over time. And we've been tracking Jacob's life for over 20 years. He's not the same person he was back in earlier chapters. We've been watching him grow and mature in real time. Now, if you recall, he just had this massive moral failure. His brother Esau, the one whom he defrauded 20 years earlier, wanted to kill him. And so Jacob fled the region to save his own skin, only to find himself under the thumb of a manipulative father-in-law. And so he managed finally, after 20 years, to escape that area and then came his way back down to the promised land. But the problem is that now he was about to encounter his long-lost brother who wanted to kill him, and he was approaching with 400 men. This doesn't look good. Now, the moral failure was that Jacob stayed on the north side of a river. Esau was approaching from the south, and he sent his family to the south side of the river in a seeming buffer from the approaching army. So an army's coming, he sends his family over there, and then he stays back hiding. While he waited on the other side of the river, feeling safe and secure, the Lord himself appeared and wrestled Jacob. And I think part of the showdown was a form of discipline for throwing his family under the proverbial bus. But what we find is that by the end of this wrestling match that went on all night, Jacob was left limping, but he also had a new name. He was no longer Jacob, he was Israel. And in fact, if we render verse 28 of chapter 32 by its actual definitions of the name, we come up with something like this. The Lord said to him, "Your name shall no longer be called deceiver, but strives with God. For you have striven with God and men and have prevailed." Now, this seemed to be the final breaking point for Jacob's fear and his deceit, and he walked out of that wrestling match a changed man. And this is where our story continues in verse 1, and this will be good to see. You see, right after the man left him, the sun was rising, and Esau looked up, and he immediately saw this attachment of men approaching, the very men that he had feared for all of this time. Now, we talked about last week that this is what the region looked like. This is an actual photo of the area where this took place. So I imagine Jacob limping himself across this ford and then dividing his family in preparation. But if you look at verse 3, rather than staying behind his family as he had done, it says, he himself went on before them. Now this man who has no longer any ability to flee, no ability to fight, he's got this dislocated hip, he goes and he stands in front of his family as a guard for this approaching army led by a man who wants to kill him. Now, there are many solid lessons to learn here, but the first is that the Lord matures us to a greater capacity. The Lord, as we walk with him, matures us to a greater capacity. And as I mentioned, we are seeing a sinful man grow in the grace and maturity of the Lord in real time. So although this was technically fair, he traded his brother's birthright for a bowl of soup. This was unkind and manipulative, though technically fair. Using pure deceit, he and his mother stole the blessing from his brother. When Esau was in a rage, rather than trying to stay and work things out, he fled to the north, and there he was for 20 years, and he was under the thumb of his manipulative father-in-law, and he refused to stand up to him. He was a passive father and husband. And then when he returned home, he used his family as a buffer for an oncoming army. And so Jacob had some significant problems, but so did David and Peter and every other human being who has ever lived, and presumably so do you and I. The point here is the promise of what theologians call sanctification. You see, after you have called upon the Lord in faith, he takes it upon himself to chisel you into the person that he wants you to be. He's not going to let you stay where you are. He wants to conform you to the image of his son. Now, consider Paul's words on this. He says, Romans 6, but now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves of God, the fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end, eternal life. And there's that word sanctification. Now, there's some confusion here because that's not what it actually says in the Greek, but this is an English problem. We have the word holy in English, but we don't have the word holy in the form of a verb. So I can't say holiify or holyification because that's not English. So they take the word holy and they translate it to sanctification because that actually is the Greek, and that's English. So all that to say, you could just exchange that word for the word holyification. The Lord's goal in your life when you become one of his is to holify you, even though that's bad English. 1 Thessalonians 4, for this is the will of God, your holyification. This is what he has for you, and this is what he was doing in the life of Jacob. And as Jacob walked with him, he was growing in capacity. So this sanctification process will certainly lead to maturity, but the maturity leads to a greater capacity to bear fruit, a greater capacity to resist temptation, a greater capacity to hate the things of the world. Now, I remember when I was 15, I got my first full-time job. Now, as a 15-year-old, I had a decent work ethic. I did lots of side jobs. A lot of you here who are 12, 13, 14, or when you were that age, you remember, working with your cousin or your uncle or whatever it might be. But at the age of 15, I got my first full-time job over the summer. I was about to turn 16. And I started at this company that was this massive building, one story, but there were about 1,000 people working there. So massive building, massive yard, lots of trucks, and there was a maintenance department, and so they hired me full-time for the summer. And one of my jobs was that if you have a building with 1,000 people and you have these water bottles, they get empty and you have to exchange the bottles, but sometimes the bottles are too heavy and people don't want to exchange them. So my job was I got this big cart and I walked around this massive building and I changed out like 40 water bottles, and that was just one of my tasks. So lots of walking, lots of lifting and carrying. And then because the maintenance department had about 5 or 6 guys full-time, they would then use me to do different jobs, and sometimes I was out on the yard. So all that to say, it was my first full-time job. And I remember my first day, I got done, and I was so stinking tired. I came home, I ate dinner, and then I went to bed. And as I was falling asleep, I was thinking, I have to do this again tomorrow. What kind of ripoff is that? How do people do this? So the next day, I dragged myself out of bed by pure willpower. I went back to work. I was so tired. That day, they had me more out in the yard, and this is June, so I'm working out in the yard. I'm weed eating and doing various things. And by 4:30, I'm so exhausted that I'm walking down the hall. Again, remember, this is a massive building. It's like a half a mile just to get from, one place to the other. And I'm walking down the hall, and at a certain point, I'm getting dizzy, and I kind of stumbled and hit the wall. And then there was a guy in a suit who saw me and reported me for being on drugs. So then the maintenance department had to come in and say, oh, no, trust me, he's okay. We were with him. He's just new at this. So it was brutal. And then what happened was I held on. And then by the weekend, I had emotionally recovered and so on. And it started all over again on Monday. And what did I find? I find that my body was adapting to the work, all of the walking and lifting. And then my mind was adapting to the idea that I have to do this every single day. So all that to say that as I matured, my capacity to work increased. Now, working a 40-hour week, that would be cake right now. You see, when we walk with the Lord, He grows our capacity, He grows our responsibility, He grows our work ethic, He even grows, and this is miraculous, our tolerance for people. That can be very hard. The level of kindness that maybe we should, exude for people, He grows us in that capacity. Our tolerance and kindness to people, our service in the church, which, by the way, we had a church work day yesterday. We had some serious people show up. We got some stuff done. You probably noticed the well-manicured hillside. We really appreciate everyone who showed up. But all that to say, we walk with God. He takes our maturity. He increases our capacity. And in the case of Jacob, his capacity for confrontation finally matured enough to have a one-on-one. He seemed to be afraid to confront anyone, but the Lord worked this out in his life. But more than that, it also challenged his ability to confront his fears. And this is one of the things that the Lord calls us to do, is to confront our fears. Now, the scripture has much to say about this topic. It's such an issue that the word fear appears 437 times in the Bible. Now, there's more than that because there's different iterations of the word like feared or fearing, and I didn't even include those. Here's just 2 examples. The psalmist said, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold in my life, of whom shall I be afraid?" Now, here's one from Paul. "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." You see, Jacob has been walking with the Lord. He's growing in maturity. And the previous night, he had this wrestling match that pushed his maturity to a new level. He left that bout a changed man and with a new name. And with this greater capacity and with having conquered his fear, what do we find? We find something absolutely amazing. I imagine Jacob standing on the other side of the river, and he had literally just got done wrestling all night. Now, I don't know if you've ever wrestled before. It's pretty messy. And I want you to imagine doing that in the wilderness. How much dirt there would be. He's covered with sweat. And the sweat is dried, it's dirty. He's been on the ground rolling around fighting. He's got dirt in his hair and his beard. It's all in his ear. I mean, he's all crazy dirty and sweaty and exhausted. And his hip was just disjointed. So he's limping across and he sees this army of 400 men approaching. But now he's a changed man. He's like, I'm not staying over here anymore. And so what does he do? He crosses the river. And now he's like half wet, half dry, dirty, smelly, gross. And he comes up and he starts dividing up his family. And what does he do? Rather than hiding in the back, he walks to the front. And imagine that. Here's this limping guy, and there's this army approaching, and he just walks out to the front and plants himself. This isn't the same guy. And I imagine all the servants and his family, they're like, oh, wow, what's up with him? He never goes to the front. Like, he puts us up there. What's going on? The Lord increased his capacity, gave him the power to confront his fear. But then with this act of faith and maturity, we read of a gracious peace that was restored. Now, here's something that I have purposefully not said over the last few sessions because I know how the story ends. I've been hyping up that Esau, with this attachment of 400 men, that they were coming to kill Jacob, and that this was likely an armed mob. And that's probably exactly what Jacob thought. But it's not even clear that Esau ever intended to hurt his brother, or that this was even an army. In verse 4, it says, Esau ran to meet him, and then stabbed him and killed him for what he did. No. Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. There was no violent confrontation. This whole story was a big, fat nothing burger. This was not an invading army. This was Esau traveling in the wilderness with an attachment of men. And I don't know if Jacob was actually in any real danger, but he thought he was. You see, being cautious is a virtue, being careful is a virtue, being wise is a virtue. But sometimes our greatest fears are totally unfounded. We can spend years being held hostage by what might happen. And this entire story was based upon Jacob's fear of his brother. Now, here's a quote from Seneca, who was a Roman Stoic. And I understand that Seneca was not a Christian, but these are curious observations about people and about fear. Check out what he wrote some 2,000 years ago. There are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. We suffer more in our imagination than in reality. Here's another one. He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a man who is alive. And I think these observations described Jacob perfectly. And if we are not careful, we could spend years of our lives, decades of our lives, being held hostage by what might happen. And the lesson, therefore, is that sometimes our fears are unfounded. Now, sometimes there's things over which we ought to legitimately be afraid. You're walking in the wilderness and you hear a sudden rattling sound, or there's a sound of a grizzly bear. There are things over which you ought to be afraid, but there are many that are unfounded. Now, I heard an interesting story about the African impala, which is also the name of a car, but I'm speaking of the beast. Now, when I see this, my first thought is the third week in September. That's the opening of deer season, if you're not familiar. An African impala apparently can jump 9 feet high. That's a lot of height there. And based upon the 9 foot, it probably can jump 20 feet out. So this animal has the ability to fling itself into the stratosphere, as it's doing here. Well, the story goes that if you were to capture one of these animals and put them in a zoo, you'd probably have to have super high fences to keep them in. But what they discovered is that they don't really need a high fence at all. They only need about a 4-foot tall fence because these are small little deer. All you need is a 4-foot fence that they can't see through. Because what happens is the impala, if I'm the impala and here's the wall, I could jump over the wall easily, but it's not going to jump because it can't see what's on the other side. So it won't jump. It'll just stay inside the cage, and it won't leave because it doesn't know what's on the other side. Well, I think the lesson is kind of easy. That these fears that we have keep us in prison, and we have the ability to jump, but because we can't see the other side, we stay comfortably trapped. Well, now that the fear of violence has passed, both brothers have this emotional catharsis, and we read of the normal sorts of conversations that two long-lost family members would have with each other in verse 5. Esau asks Jacob about his family, and they present themselves to each other, and then there's a playful argument. Oh, I'm going to give you these gifts. No, I don't want the gifts. You keep the gifts. The same thing that happens when families go out to dinner. No, I'll pay. No, you paid last time, and they're arguing over who's going to pay, and so on. And so they have this interchange, and finally at the end, Esau accepts the gifts that Jacob gave him, which we discussed was around $800,000, and I think was fair based upon the harm that Jacob did to his brother. So Esau relents, he accepts the gifts, and then in verses 12 to 17, they discuss travel. And they have this other discussion about both groups journeying back together, and ultimately what they decide is to part ways. Which, by the way, is a good observation that sometimes when we have these big conflicts and when we work them out, it's still okay to part ways. Like, we don't have to like the people. We don't have to live with them. We made peace. Everything is fine. And now you're going to go that way, and I'm going to go this way, and maybe that's better for everyone. And so that's what they do. They split up. Esau goes back home, and then here on our map, you'll see there's this little dot right here. This is the river over which this took place. And then Jacob made his way to the west to a place called Succoth, which wasn't the name at the time. That means tent, and he named it that. And so they have this departure. They split up, and they go their own ways. Now, this is also a reminder that after the mountaintop, life goes on. Let me explain. This was one of the apex events in Jacob's life. After 20 years of a broken relationship with his brother, things are mended. But more than that, Jacob had this awesome experience wrestling with God, and he walked away having survived. He also walked away with a blessing and a new name. This was one of those life-changing events that was probably bigger than the Jacob's ladder and the portal into heaven. He likely thought about this moment for the rest of his life, and his children and his grandchildren probably made him tell the story over and over again. Oh, there goes Grandpa limping by with his hurt hip. Will you tell us the story again about how you actually wrestled with God? I wonder how it is for a teenager coming back from youth camp. They're away from the humdrum of life. They're away from their annoying siblings. They're away from their parents. Notice I didn't say annoying parents. I just said parents. And they have this mountaintop spiritual experience. And it feels like God really moved in their lives, and they feel changed. And then what happens is they come home, and it's just like, I still have to do chores, and I still have to do homework, and my brother still smells. And he thinks that the Axe body spray is going to cover it, but it doesn't. How does a woman feel when she goes on a ladies' retreat and has this awesome experience, and the Lord works wonders in her heart and does all of this stuff, and she just feels like refreshed and healed, and all of this stuff is going on spiritually, and then what happens? She comes home and then has to return to the mundane tasks. We must remember that the Lord does miraculous things in our lives. He takes us to the mountaintops. But we must always return to our mundane duties. We were not designed to live permanently either on the Mount of Transfiguration or in the valley of the shadow of death. Most of our lives is the common practice of living out our faith in the prosaic plains of life. So what happened to Jacob? And how is this connected to the story? He has this powerful, life-changing experience, and then what does it say? He went back up and set up tents for his flocks. Like, that's it. This awesome experience, wrestling with God. Next day, he's setting up his tent and feeding his animals. There's an author by the name of Jim Collins, and he typically writes about business strategy, but in his new book, What to Make of a Life, he discusses what happens when we have this mountaintop experience and then we have to walk down. What happens after you win the Super Bowl and then you have to retire? Like, how do you live after that? How do you live when you come back from this awesome retreat? How do you move forward when you wrestled with God, got a new name, and got a blessing and settled a 20-year dispute? How does it feel, and what do you do when you get off the mountain? Well, in his book, Jim Collins, he tells a story of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. These were two ladies who formed this partnership. They actually met in a police station in 1909 because they were fighting for women's suffrage. And together they led the U.S. suffrage movement. They organized marches, hunger strikes, and protests, and they had this relentless sense of advocacy, and their combined efforts were instrumental in the passage of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting the women the right to vote. And so imagine, here are these two ladies, and they spend all of their lives fighting, and they win. They actually get to make an amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. And then what do you do with your life? And this is what Jim Collins tracks in this book. And if we're not careful, we can want to live our lives on the mountain and then become useless in the valley. And so what did Jacob do after walking off this proverbial mountain? He built a house, he set up tents for his flock, and it's difficult to go from this awesome spiritual experience to having to change the oil in your car and fold your socks and stack wood and do your taxes. Well, we hate that anytime, but you get the idea. This is a hard transition to make. But we need to remember, we can't live on the mountain forever, and we shouldn't suspect that the Lord is going to do these things in our lives every day. We must return to the normal life of caring for our flocks and our herds, and in our case, just going to work, caring for your family, and so on. Now, our story ends with Jacob ultimately making it back home. And what do we find? Back to our map. There he was in Peniel, where he wrestled with God. He went to Succoth for a while, and then he traveled west to a place called Shechem. And there, he bought a piece of real estate from the locals. He established a tent, and then he set up an altar, and he gave it an interesting name. In Hebrew, it's El Elohi Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. Now, we hear this word so many times that it becomes commonplace, but I want you to notice something. This is the first record of Jacob taking up the mantle of his new name. He wasn't worshiping the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, or even the God of Jacob. He was worshiping the God of Israel. He had cast off his old self, and the Lord is now the God of Israel, Jacob's new name and his new identity. And so he returned home, accepted his new name, and set up a place to worship the Lord. And so our lesson here is simple. Whether it's feast or famine, home or abroad, war or peace, we should continue to walk with God. Now remember, I said at the beginning, that the abundant life that God has for you is to spend your life walking with him, but I'm sad to say we can't, because he does not accept us. Because in our sin and our rebellion against the Lord, we are separated from him. We have no ability to walk with him, and we have no ability to please him. We have no ability to commune with our Creator, except that he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross, And on that cross, he took the sins of the world upon himself. He took our punishment so that we might live. And so when we call upon Jesus as Lord and place our faith in him, what happens is we are forgiven of our sin, and then we are brought into full fellowship with our Creator. We are invited to walk with him. And as we walk with him, he will mature us. He will grow us. He will increase our capacity. And in him, we will have the abundant life. So like Jacob, through the ups and downs, the mountains and the valleys, will you walk with the Lord?